In 1983, director Tony Scott released his debut feature film, an art house vampire movie starring David Bowie called The Hunger. The film opens with gothic rock star Peter Murphy performing his hit single, Bela Lugosi's Dead.
Bela Lugosi's dead, the bell has left the bell tower.
In many ways, it's hard to think of a more apt opening to a film which would usher the vampire subgenre into a whole new era. The 1980s transformed the vampire movie into something more hip, mainstream, and something that skewed towards a younger audience. Films like The Hunger, The Lost Boys, and Near Dark would prove just how malleable, cool, and enduringly popular the vampire movie could be. Join me as we continue exploring the evolution of the vampire, and we discuss Tony Scott's The Hunger and Catherine Bigelow's Near Dark. Welcome back to the evolution of horror. My name is Mike Munzer, and as ever, I am your host. If you're tuning in for the first time, then welcome. In this podcast, we explore and dissect the history and the evolution of the horror genre by looking at particular subgenres one series at a time. We are currently in the middle of our 8th series exploring the evolution of the vampire movie, and this is part 14. This week's episode is sponsored by $20 Patreon subscriber Matthew Taylor. And in this week's episode, as that intro suggested, we're moving into the 1980s to discuss two incredibly cool vampire films by two incredibly cool directors. That's Near Dark from 1987 and The Hunger from 1983. So later on in this episode, I'll be joined by producer Jen Handorf to discuss Near Dark in detail. But first of all, let's get into The Hunger. Joining me to discuss The Hunger, we've got a returning guest. She was here only a few weeks ago in the vampire series discussing Dracula with me, and she's back. Welcome to the podcast, filmmaker Axelle Carolyn. Hello, Axelle.
Hi, long time, Mike.
It's been such a long time. How have you been? How's your summer been so far?
It's been great. I just got back from shooting a TV show in New Orleans, and it was wonderful. And got to discover the city.
We were just talking before we started recording, but New Orleans is one of the places that is highest on my list for like bucket list places to visit. But how is it? Is it kind of everything you imagine?
It was, yes, it really was. And it's strange to visit when it's the pandemic and you're there for a job, so you have to be very careful. You have to avoid going to indoor crowded places, which is one of the things that New Orleans kind of known for. Jazz Fest was going on at the same time, but still it's so beautiful. It's so great. And I was there to shoot an Anne Rice adaptation. So you can't, it's just such a perfect, she's so tied into that city, and it means you can go and shoot things that look you don't have to try to make it look like another city. You're really going for that, like that local, you want to make it look like it's New Orleans. So you get to see all the sights and film all the greatest places. And it was so much fun.
What is the Anne, are you allowed to tell us what the Anne Rice adaptation is?
Sure. It's an adaptation of Mayfair Witches. It's done for AMC, and I just directed 2 episodes.
Amazing.
And I think it comes out, they're doing an Interview with the Vampire.
Yes.
And that starts airing, I think, in October. And then I suspect that Witches will be right after that.
That's awesome. I love this kind of Anne Rice resurgence. The Interview with the Vampire TV show looks really interesting as well. And I feel like even just this week it's been getting a lot of buzz. So yeah, everyone's looking forward
they
to
were
that.
at Comic-Con and they released some materials. And they've made some interesting changes and it looks beautiful. And I know that we shot on the same stages for some stuff. So I saw some of the sets that they were on, and it looked gorgeous. It's just going to be, they went all in. So I'm very excited to see it.
That's awesome. Yeah, very, very excited. And I can't remember, were you a big fan? Because we've talked about vampires the last time you were here, obviously, in the subgenre, and obviously you're a fan, and we talked specifically about some of the old classics, right? Bela Lugosi and that kind of thing. But moving forward into the sort of 80s and 90s, and the way that vampires did become a little bit more romantic and sexy with stuff like Anne Rice, right? Are you kind of a fan of that type of vampire that we get that we've had a lot of, I suppose, over the last few decades?
Yeah, I like it all, man. I think it's great. I think I love that they're such a versatile monster where you can have the Tom Cruise or Brad Pitt playing a vampire, but you could also have like the creatures from The Strain or from, those really disgusting kind of Nosferatu types that look just like a beast. There's everything in between. Very few monsters have that range, I guess, which explains the longevity of it, I suppose. But I've only seen the first Twilight movie. So in terms of peak romantic vampires of the last 15 years, I guess I'm kind of out of the loop.
Yeah.
But it catered to a specific audience and that audience loved it. And so that, again, shows you how versatile it is.
Absolutely. Well, let's get into this week's film. We're moving from the erotic 70s into the trendy 80s with this as a kind of interesting transition movie, I think, right? So let's begin by talking about The Hunger from 1983.
Sarah Roberts is in jeopardy.
Hey, lady, how about it?
Stay with her. Help her, for she has begun to feel the awful horror of the hunger. John Blaylock, the hunger has given him everlasting life. Until now, pray for him. Miriam Blaylock. She feeds 1 day in 7 on the unsuspecting, and soon she will turn into something that you will never be able to forget. No matter how hard and how long you try, fear her.
What have you done to me?
Forever and ever.
And life signs terminate right here.
So, The Hunger. Axelle, set the scene for us. Give us a quick plot synopsis for The Hunger.
Right, that's going to be fast. The Hunger is the story of an ancient vampire called Miriam, played by Catherine Deneuve. We're kind of told that she dates back to ancient Egypt, although she is evidently French. And she has a partner called John, who she converted into a vampire, I think in the 18th century. And they've been living together ever since. And she's promised him eternal life. And he's starting to show signs of aging. He's played by David Bowie. He looks incredible. And one day he looks like he's 30. And the next day he's pretty much an old man who's falling apart. And he tries to find science that can help reverse the process. And he finds it too late. But he does meet this doctor played by Susan Sarandon, who ends up being kind of taking his place as Miriam's next love interest.
Yeah, and that is kind of it, right? It is like you say, it doesn't take long. It's kind of like...
That's kind of it, yeah.
Catherine Deneuve is with David Bowie in the first half of the movie, and then Susan Sarandon in the second half, and then it's kind of ends, right? It's really interesting. So I remember you telling me last time you were here that this is one of your favourite ever vampire movies, right? Tell me a little bit about your kind of relationship and history with this movie.
I was a goth when I was a teenager. Mm-hmm. I have many, many very silly photos of me with like purple hair and black lipstick and
amazing
the works. And it was hard in the late 90s to find many things. I thought at the time to find many things that suited those goth sensibilities because it wasn't very popular. I think we had a resurgence since, and when I discovered The Hunger, it felt both like, oh my God, this is everything I want in the movie. And oh shit, it's so dated. Because by the late 90s, it seemed as cool as to us like 2010. Yeah. It didn't seem cool at all. It was like, oh great, it's the 80s. It was like, oh my God, look at the hair, look at the style, look at the editing, it's kind of weirdly embarrassing that I like this movie. So I had this kind of strange love-hate relationship with it. And the opening of the movie very famously features Peter Murphy from Bauhaus, and they're playing Bela Lugosi's Dead, and I was a huge fan, and so it was like, David Bowie and Peter Murphy in the same scene, my brain's going to explode. And yes. But it was mostly that, and it was the aesthetics of it that I loved, which I guess is what most people love in this movie. And then it's rediscovering it a few years later that I felt like it also has a very strong emotional core to me, and it really, I can't really explain why, but it really speaks to me every time I watch it. There's really something thematically and with the characters that I feel really affects me somehow.
Yeah, it's just got such a vibe, this film, doesn't it? It's all vibe, really, in a way. Like, that's kind of how it feels. And I really enjoy it. There are things about it that I kind of wish I wish I had more of certain things, you know? Like, I do wish that it had a little... Like, I do kind of agree with the criticisms that it feels a little bit style over substance for me. But we'll talk about that as it goes. But the style is so incredible. It's still... such a pleasure to watch, and I love that opening, like that, like you say, the kind of Bela Lugosi is dead. That whole first 10 minutes is just astonishing, I think, you know.
And setting up those two vampires going to a club to find their victims who they seduce, and it's just the most beautiful people dressed in the most interesting ways, and then they bring them home, and then the blood shows up. It's just it's like you said, it's such a vibe, but it's also, I feel like it goes much beyond that personally. I know even yesterday I was researching to see, does anybody else see this as being more than just style over substance? And I don't agree with the fact that style and substance have to be opposites. I feel like style is there to complement something, and you can express so much through the style of a movie. And I think we're just obsessed with plot. I think that there's such an over-reliance on plot in many movies. And the second that you don't have constant exposition or dialogue or twists or things to kind of move the plot forward, and you're just sitting there with the emotions and the characters, people feel like the movie is a little bit empty. But I find that you can still have a ton of emotion come out of something like this. And it's not just like, oh my God, look at this pretty shot. It's also, it genuinely makes me feel things. So to me, it's perfectly successful in that way.
Yeah, and actually me too. Like, it does get me emotionally, and that's why I still really like it. Because for me, my least favorite types of movies are ones that have style to the point where I don't even feel anything, like I'm left cold by it other than thinking that looks beautiful. Yeah. And I've got to admit, that's what I find with movies like Giallo and that kind of thing, where I can appreciate how great they look and sound, but I kind of feel nothing watching them, right? And that's
I completely agree.
It's kind of how I feel about people like Wes Anderson too, like outside of the horror genre. Like again, I can look at a shot of somebody like that and go, yes, that's beautifully composed, but that's it, kind of thing. Mm-hmm. Whereas with this movie, it really does get you in the feels, I think. Particularly I think for me, it does sort of peak with the David Bowie section, with him aging and his kind of decline. Like, that's some of my favourite stuff, I think, like right in the middle of the film, I guess. But that really does have a kind of emotional core to it, I think, that stuff, you know? Yeah,
that section is incredibly strong, and you're just, the music is beautiful too at that point, that little kind of piano piece that they keep playing that's very nostalgic, and that idea of eternal youth. And it's really interesting that when you look at the myth of the vampire, we always, up to that point at least, the main themes were the blood, the deaths, the killing, the surviving, the fact that they're the living dead. And here, none of that really matters. What really matters is that they're immortal, and that being immortal is incredibly lonely, and that finding a partner is all that gives meaning to this woman's life, to this vampire's life. And that promise of eternal life and that promise of eternal youth. And those are things that I don't know. I mean, I haven't given this a ton of thought, but I would think that it happened fairly late in the, I know Bela Lugosi mentions, to be truly dead, that would be glorious.
Yeah.
But there's not a lot of thought being given to that idea nonetheless. But Anne Rice, when she wrote Interview with the Vampire, it's all about kind of the weight of immortality and the fact that you're going to lose people along the way. And I believe that, I think she wrote Interview with the Vampire because she'd lost a daughter. And that's why she had this character of this little girl who can't age and can't die, which is incredibly touching.
Yeah.
But it's just such a cool way of, dealing with the fact that this is it. Life is grief. Life is losing the people who matter the most. And if you live 3,000 years or 4,000 years like she does, the amount of people you're going to lose along the way is just staggering. And I think that's why I love that scene at the end, that's kind of overshot in some ways and over stylized, but it's really cool, where she's dragged by the bodies and all those amazing kind of corpse creations that look fantastic. And I really understand that. Like, it's one of those moments that actually made me very emotional. That idea of like, this is being dragged down by the weight of all the people you've lost and how they're never really gone for you, and how you can't, when she says, I can't kill you, I can't forget about you. I have to put you up in the attic of my brain. And it's eventually, if you dwell too much on that, it drags you down.
Yeah.
I don't know. There's many themes about that, about like relationships, about leaving an ex behind, about being the ex who's left behind. Also, if you look at it from the point of view of David Bowie or the other ones who are in the attic, like, oh, now I'm just one of your corpses kind of thing.
Yeah, right.
There's a lot about that I find really emotionally very resonant.
I agree, definitely. Yeah, and the performances kind of really sell it too, I think, throughout that.
Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit about, I mean, it's really interesting that you said, you kind of fell in love with this movie when you were a goth teenager, right? Because that's really funny, because that's something I've talked about a lot with a lot of guests, that kind of vampires do kind of appeal to that kind of goth teenage sensibility in a lot of ways. And it really feels like, we talked about this in the past, but it feels like around the 80s into the 90s when that really starts, when vampires start becoming these kind of very cool icons. Like we're past the kind of the gothic Universal or Hammer phases now. And is this kind of where this starts, do you think? Like movies like The Hunger, do you think this is where this kind of begins, this era of vampires suddenly becoming cool, with people like David Bowie, with soundtracks like what we've got in this movie, I
think around this time, and I think that, again, going back to Anne Rice, I think that her book was hugely influential, because the book comes up with a lot of those themes and a lot of those ideas, and beautiful vampire you aspire to be, and people want to be Lestat or want to be with Lestat. And I think that was a huge part of it. I mean, the seeds of it were there all along, but she really created something. And I know that Tony Scott had wanted to adapt the book, and then that didn't pan out. And it turned out that MGM was developing the adaptation of The Hunger, and he ended up doing that. And it was written by, forgot the name of the author, but the same guy who wrote the book that became Wolfen.
Yes.
So he did a werewolf, and then he did a vampire, and it's both really interesting takes. And and I think then that turns into The Lost Boys. It turns into Near Dark. It turns into all those kind of teenage. It's an expression of that idea that I guess I definitely felt very strongly when I was a teenager. That kind of like, I don't think I'm ever going to die, but I'm also terrified of dying. I'm terrified of losing people around me. Like all those questions of mortality that suddenly fall on your shoulders when you're like 15 and trying to figure yourself out and figure out the world, and how everything seems like such a massive, everything, the stakes of everything are so huge. And I don't know, it really captures a teenage state of mind very beautifully, I think.
Totally. And how important is it? How important is the cast, particularly these three lead cast members, and I guess particularly David Bowie, to this idea of this movie being very cool, I suppose?
It's so classy, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, Catherine Deneuve, and dressed in those like Yves Saint Laurent clothing and just looking so iconic. And it's just it brings so much class to it. And David Bowie being, I know a lot of people are upset that you would pick someone so charismatic and so gorgeous to play a part you only see without prosthetics for like 10 minutes of the movie. But that's what makes it so striking, though. That's what makes it so poignant. You see him being he's at the absolute, like that's the high point of David Bowie's beauty. He was like 36, I think, when he met. It's peak Bowie for sure. I mean, I don't think any creature's ever looked better than he has in this movie. And then he suddenly like sees the liver spots on his hands, and sees like he looks more tired, and he's got wrinkles, and I think everybody at a certain point is like, oh my God, here's my first wrinkle. And then it's all downhill from there.
Right. It's true. I think that's important. Like the Bowie as an icon, and so, like you say, so beautiful at his peak at this point. And
he's always looked somehow immortal.
Yes.
He's always looked like someone who would always be there. And he's reinvented himself so many times that it's always seemed like he was completely fresh. Like I think that right after this movie came out, he came up with like a different personality. So he was more of that like the 80s pop star. After that, he was less the Ziggy Stardust of the 70s. And he's kind of kept it so interesting and so fresh that I think no one really, even when he was towards the end of his life, ever thought of him as an older man. Like that's just not. So it makes it all the more striking when you see him suddenly, that scene in the bathroom where he's looking at the younger man and looking with envy and looking with kind of how do I keep myself that young, and he's suddenly frail, and Yeah, I think it was incredibly smart to pick someone like that.
I agree. And then, of course, Susan Sarandon as well, who, you know, even at this point was known for like kind of a mix, I suppose, of kind of quite prestigious movies, but then also that kind of cult appeal with films like Rocky Horror, right, as well. So again, it kind of, she has that kind of slight outsider, maybe slightly more queer or whatever, you know, kind of appeal as well, even at this point, I think, you know. So it's a really interesting cast.
Keeps it slightly more grounded too. I think her performance is a little bit more grounded. Everything else is very stylized and very everything. I think everybody was very aware of the tone of the movie and of what they were going for. And so all the performances, you could say, are, if you looked at it objectively, outside of the context of the movie, could seem a bit stiff or a little bit too big or strangely calibrated, but they're perfect for what they're trying to do here. They really work really beautifully within the context of this incredibly stylish environment where everything is just shadows and reflections and extreme close-ups, and like everyone's face is half in this beautiful white light and half in the shadow.
Yeah, and lots
like
of
blinds and curtains.
Yeah.
Oh my God, yes.
So many veiled curtains.
And a lot of people being backlit, and like it's just, and so much haze, and like the play with the light is so great. It's just a gorgeous movie. And those gorgeous people in it.
Well, let's talk about the way this movie looks and feels then, and Tony Scott specifically. This was his debut feature, I think, right? Tony Scott.
Yeah.
What an entrance, I suppose, in a way. And Tony Scott, I think, kind of became known for doing these kind of very slick, stylish movies, right, as his career went on. But what do you think of him as a director, and how, I guess, typical of Tony Scott is this movie that we get here, his first film?
You know, this is my favorite of his, and which is perhaps embarrassing because there's so many great ones. But he's this movie to me feels like it embodies the fact that this is an art student who went to art school, made art short films, and then went on to make commercials with his brother's company, and that was his way into professional life as a filmmaker. And then when you combine commercials with artsy sensibilities, this is what comes out. Yeah. This is just such a perfect synthesis of the two. And there's something very artsy about it, but there's also something that's very MTV about it, about this movie. And I love that. And I think it defines the style of editing that he brought to it, to the genre and to filmmaking in general. And this kind of, especially with the opening scene, it feels a little bit like you see the makings of what MTV will turn out to be.
Definitely, yeah.
And everything's very slick. Everything looks very beautiful. I could be wrong with that, but I think he's always worked with different cinematographers, but he's always kept the visuals very, very interesting in his movies. Like every movie he's made has always had a very distinct personality visually and stylistically, and it's very impressive to watch. But this one is the most kind of out and out stylish and cohesive, I think, in the way that it looks. I mean, for a first movie, it's absolutely astounding, I think. And it was very criticized at the time, like we just discussed, with the style over substance and the fact that it's a strange, like, you know, that he was slaughtered by a lot of reviews. And I think I was reading about that, and it's really, I think that's something that always stayed with him, and that he never was fully proud of the movie afterwards, which I think is total shame, because he said he never read another review until he made Men on Fire. So like 20 years of not staying away from reviews. Wow. Which is great. I guess at the time you can do something like that. Nowadays it's everywhere.
Yeah, you can't really avoid it, right? Yeah, I can imagine. Yeah, what an interesting filmmaker. And you're right, you know, even though he's worked with different people and different cinematographers and very different types of material, you can kind of feel that Tony Scott-ness in a lot of his movies. I think the first Tony Scott film that I remember kind of really falling in love with when I was young was True Romance, the Tarantino written one. And again, like as well as looking so beautiful, such amazing use of music and needle drops. I guess that kind of, you know, coincides with Tarantino's work as well. But like that kind of mix of pop music and almost music video sensibility, but also with like classical music as well, and that kind of thing.
And the theme is beautiful in True Romance, the Hans Zimmer theme, which is completely not what you expect from Hans Zimmer or from something like this, like something that's like a crime movie. But it's similar in some ways in that it's also very, very stylish and very kind of bright and poppy, but then it has a real heart. It has real core. And I think that more people have found that in True Romance than in The Hunger. But again, if a movie like this hits the right chord for you, it's I don't know. Again, this is not one I would recommend to everybody and saying you'll find deep substance in this, but I really do.
No, I think that's great. And also and maybe also it is that it's so of its time, like you said, it feels so 80s, like when you first saw it, and it really does, doesn't it? And maybe that's the case with a lot of his movies, because other things I'm thinking of, whether it's Top Gun or True Romance, like they do feel very much like time capsules, and maybe that's because of the reliance on the style, the music, and that kind of thing. But it's not necessarily that's a bad thing, but they do very much feel capsules of the time they were made, don't they? I think.
It's true, and it's interesting because if you think if this movie came out now, I think it would actually be a big hit. Yeah. Because we're so much into the 80s. But also, if you did something like this, if you use, and I'm sure it's being done and I'm just not thinking of the example, but if you make a movie like this that's so steeped in the current culture and so kind of light on plot, but heavy on style and emotions and those kinds of, I think we're much more open to this kind of movie nowadays.
Yes.
Like you said, that the movie that's pure vibe, I think we're
Absolutely.
way more open to that now in 2022 than we were in 1983, I suspect. So maybe had he made this in a different context, 40 years later, it would have worked out really nicely.
Oh, totally. And I do think there is like a real deep appreciation for this movie now. Not just because the 80s have suddenly become incredibly cool again, right? 80s look, 80s music, 80s aesthetic, that is incredibly trendy and popular right now again. But also that, like you say, that kind of movie as vibe, like that is what audiences eat up right now, I think.
Yeah. So it's a very A24 movie.
It is, isn't it? It is, yeah. So let's talk a little bit about the story itself, or what they're like. I'm kind of interested in the vampire kind of side to this as well, and the way the vampirism is sort of portrayed, because we don't necessarily see traditional vampirism. We don't like even the fact that they can't die, right? That we don't really see vampires die in this. They don't necessarily have fangs. They don't, they do seem to exist in daylight and this kind of thing. But what do you think of the way that the vampirism itself is kind of portrayed in this?
Right. It feels like it's almost something he wasn't particularly interested in. It's an excuse for his characters to be immortal, but it's not really essential to the plot. Like there's none of the usual trappings of vampirism are in here. They walk out in the sun. They don't, they're not scared of garlic. They don't get staked, or you don't cut off their heads, or none of that exists in here. I love that idea that once you've done your time and you get old, it's very sudden. And then you never die, and you're just this eternal corpse.
Yeah.
And it's absolutely terrifying. And that happens, I suppose, to her as well, even as an immortal being from the start, not someone who's been converted, like what she's done to others. But even she ends up like that. And again, there's something like about that inevitability of aging and decay that's even in a creature that's supposed to be transcending time, and it's very human. But yeah, the blood is not there. There's no, like you said, there's no fangs. They use those little ankhs, which have it's the Egyptian symbol of eternal life.
Yes.
Which again is everything is themed around that idea of living forever, and that kind of the drag of it. It's not really interested otherwise in the idea of being the living dead or anything like that. It's very much kind of.
I'm trying to think. Do they even say the word vampire at all in the whole movie? I'm not even sure if they do. If it's kind of explicitly talked about.
I don't think so. And also, you think, when he starts aging, you think, well, go and drink some blood, and then he doesn't for a while, and he tries and he fails, and then. A couple of times, and then when he finally does, and he kills the little girl that she was grooming to be her next partner. He doesn't do anything. He keeps aging. It just doesn't like the blood does not seem to be the thing that sustains them. We don't even know what role that really plays for them. Is it just something that's exciting and pleasurable, or is it something that really is supposed to be something they have to do? It's very hard to tell. There's something interesting about the way that Susan Sarandon's character at the end tries to kill herself. because she doesn't want to drink blood and she doesn't want to live that eternal life, and she's rejecting it. And the scene is beautiful. I find, like, they're kissing each other and she stabs herself in the neck.
Yeah.
And then all that blood pours into Catherine Deneuve, who keeps kissing and drinking the blood at the same time. It's so weird. But, and I know that Tony Scott's interest in that scene and in the ending of the movie was, would you want to live forever if the price was addiction?
Yeah.
And it was very heavily about addiction to him. And at like in the 80s, at a time where everybody in Hollywood was doing coke, and I guess it was very thematically resonant. But that's a little bit destroyed by the ending then.
Which the studio made him change.
Right? Yeah, and it really feels like something that's tagged onto it. I rewatched the movie last night, and then I felt like, what the hell is this last scene with the balcony and all that stuff? That doesn't even look like the rest of the movie, because suddenly you can tell that you're not in New York.
I know.
Which the entire movie made you feel like you were in New York, even though it's shot in London.
Yeah.
And then suddenly it's like, fuck it.
I know.
Let show you where we are.
Yeah.
It's so bizarre. And it doesn't say anything, and then I listened to the commentary, and sure enough, there he is just saying, that the studio wanted to set up a potential sequel at the end. And so we wanted a character that survived at the end.
Right. That does make a lot of sense. I do think it's interesting as well that it is, almost treated as a kind of virus or something, right? There is almost a kind of sci-fi element to this, where Susan Sarandon's character is kind of in like looking into this, and they're using kind of like, simians to test things on, and this idea of aging and rapidly aging and stopping aging and blood, and almost the way that it's treated when she becomes a vampire is almost like she's been infected with some kind of blood virus or something.
Yeah,
right?
Although I feel like it's almost like a red herring, because she does try to use her scientific methods to understand what's going on, but all she knows is like, oh, you have the blood of a different creature inside you.
Yeah.
And they don't know what this creature is. And that's kind of the extent of what they can do about it. It's not like she can apply any science to it. She understands, oh, this being is a completely different being, and I don't know what it is, and I have to accept that it exists. And then there's nothing I can do about it. And it's almost like, well, science is completely useless in the face of what this person is. And I guess that's what leads her to committing suicide, is that she doesn't, if she's all about science and all about understanding things through that lens, suddenly this is something she has no control over.
Right, and ultimately there is no rhyme or reason to what happens to these vampires, is there really? Like you said, why does David Bowie, after having lived for however many decades or centuries, why does he suddenly rapidly age? Like, why does that happen? And why does blood not help him? Like, it's not really explained, is it? It's like he hits a certain point and then he ages and that's it.
I should have read the book. I feel like I should check out what the original novel says. I suspect it's very, very different from this. And maybe has more of those answers. But the way I imagine it is that she is born a vampire, and that's why she's lived this entire time. And then when she turns other people to try to be with her and have some kind of companion, she knows that's never going to last very long. And I find it really, really creepy that she's grooming this girl to be the next person. So she knows already that this is going to happen to him. And she's like, well, I was hoping for a miracle, and I thought maybe you were going to last longer. But actually she says that, but she's known for at least a year that it would happen, because she's been teaching the piano or whatever, or the cello or whatever they've been teaching to that girl for like a year. So she's been preparing for that moment. Although she probably doesn't think that it was going to be that quickly, I suppose, since the girl was like, what, 15 or something? Yeah. But
that's what
it's really interesting.
That's what I was trying to work out. Like, is Catherine Deneuve's character somehow in control of that? Like, you talked about that idea of kind of exes, and this idea of like, is it when she sort of like gets bored with them, they they're ready to age and go in the attic? It's like, obviously none of that is really overtly explained, but I wondered if it was that, almost like she's now looking for the next one, I don't know, but it's all
I hadn't
left
thought
very...
of that. It's pretty cool.
But
I hadn't thought of that. But it's I think, to me, as much as you can see it all as a metaphor for addiction, I think it's a metaphor for relationships very strongly.
Yeah, it's serial monogamy. That's like what it is.
Yeah. Serial monogamy, and the pain of it, and the pain of relying on someone else and then losing that person, or making the choice to move on. And she comes across as being very, like, she's so cold when or you could see her as that for the longest time when I was watching this, and like, she's so cold and detached when she brings him upstairs. But actually there's a lot of there's a lot of love and a lot of kind of contained, like, I don't want to show my emotions and I need to get over this and I need to, it feels very cold because she's already planned who else she's going to be with. And because she does find another companion very quickly. By the way, huge questions of consent as to the way that she takes the next one. Very clear issues there, which to me kind of makes the third part of this movie less interesting, because that's where the metaphor kind of falls apart for me. And it's that the fact that suddenly someone has to deal with the fact that they've been picked against their will is like, this is very icky, and I don't love that. I would much prefer her seducing her into the lifestyle as much as she does seduce her physically. But yeah, it's all like, again, when she goes back and she brings the dying doctor in the attic with all the dead bodies and all the exes, she keeps saying, I love you all, and there's, I don't know, I just find it, again, when you look at a length of time, and I got married, I got divorced, I found someone else, I believed this was it wasn't it. Everybody goes through that stuff in life where you go with everything you've got and you're like, this is it, I found my person. And then very often that door slams in your face and it's like, no, it wasn't. And how many times can you believe that before it breaks your heart and before it changes you completely? And you look back and you're like, I've loved all of you. I've kind of,
of course,
I've been very honest in the feelings of, and I feel that that's what happens at the end. It's the way that it changes who you are and your perception of what love is and what relationships are when you have the weight of all those past lives that you've lived with all those different people. It's, I don't know. And then I love what the corpses look like those dead bodies are so cool.
So good. I mean, let's talk about the Dick Smith makeup, shall we? The makeup effects. Because how do you think that holds up? Obviously there's that amazing section with David Bowie rapidly aging, and then, like you say, the kind of corpses in the attic at the end. But how do you think all of that looks watching it now?
I think the corpses are fantastic. I think that they remind me, I love Ghost Story, and he did the work that Dick Smith did in Ghost Story is incredible. Like, what you look up photos of all the makeup, some of them weren't even used, and they're all so beautiful and so like such creepy designs for the corpses. And this is very much the same style, and I love the way that they fall apart. I love that they're surrounded with dust, and also I feel like that sequence is, the way it's shot is really cool and really interesting, and could be, I bet on the page when you read she is torn apart by the corpses in the attic, it probably feels like that could have been super corny, but he makes something special out of it. He cuts it, and this is the way to shoot those kinds of effects, by the way. You don't spend a ton of time on your dead body. You don't overlight your prosthetics. You kind of always keep it, you calculate so that you show enough, but you don't show too much, so that it doesn't seem like it's completely fake, especially those which are all puppets and you can't move all that much. It's hard to work with, but I feel like he's done it really beautifully in this. Like both Dick Smith and Tony Scott were really nicely. The age makeup, I love the beginning of the transformation. I think that everything while he's at the medical institute is just beautiful. When he goes in the bathroom, the makeup he's wearing there is fantastic. But age makeup, I've worked with that on a couple of shows now. And there's a limit. There's like, you can age someone 20 years and it's going to look great. You can age someone 30 years, you can still make it look okay. But if you go farther than that, it's hard. It easily looks like you're just wearing a mask. Because the problem is, obviously, when you age, your face loses volume and there's like more hollowness in your face. And you can't do that by adding prosthetics to a face. Like, obviously, all you do is make the face balloon, so you have to create more volume, but it just makes the overall face look like more of a mask. And I think that it ends up being a bit of that. And his color kind of getting a little bit more yellow is a little bit extreme, and I don't love that. But yeah, there's a point where it goes, like the makeup goes a little bit too far. But when it comes to age makeups, you can't. I mean, Dick Smith was such a legend.
Amazing, right? Even when you look at some of his other movies on his resume, whether it's like obviously The Exorcist, but films like Death Becomes Her as well, and Amadeus, like amazing, just like amazing
aging
stuff.
Like Little Big Man, and he did The Godfather. Just the way that he can transform someone, and when he gets to do it subtly, it's just it's just so beautiful. He's the guy who is responsible for the careers of everybody else. Rick Baker, like he was an inspiration for everybody.
Yeah.
He was very generous with his knowledge. And I love hearing all those stories of all those prosthetics artists who've become so amazing. I'm such a huge fan of Rick Baker. Yeah. And every time you hear him talk about like being a kid and writing letters to Dick Smith and asking for advice, and then Dick Smith being like, well, stop by when you're in Los Angeles and I'll show you. And then he would just like impart knowledge upon all those kids who then went on to become the best. And this is one of the great ones that he's made. And The Exorcist, when you look at what he did on Max von Sydow, I think at the time people thought he was that age. And when he died, he looked the way that he looked like 35 years before in The Exorcist.
Honestly, like it was only a few years ago, I think, that I realized that that's not what Max von Sydow looked like at that point in time, right? It's unbelievable. It looks so good. Yeah. Yeah, I think it holds up really well. And again, you're right. It does go so far at some point that it stops necessarily looking real, but it all kind of feels like it kind of fits in the kind of slightly heightened reality vibe also that this movie has, right, throughout.
It does. I really agree. And I think that that's something that's also very important is, again, like being in control of the tone of what you're doing, which I think that this movie does really well, and creating an environment where those elements that are completely outlandish, you have an eternal woman slicing people to drink blood, and yet you kind of buy into it. It doesn't really stand out. We just said like the vampirism is so it doesn't stand out in the story because it's just kind of part of it, because everything feels a bit heightened and a little bit kind of not quite of this reality and everything. And it's part of the visual style. It's part of the way that it's edited. Like it all kind of meshes together so that there's nothing where you go, well, this is completely grand guignol. You can go, the whole thing is completely grand guignol, but at least everything is very cohesive.
Yeah, you're right. And I wondered, I couldn't find too much written about this, but obviously 1983... I wondered if this in any way is kind of communicating with the AIDS epidemic as well. This idea of kind of, it's very sexual, and this idea of passing blood and that sudden kind of transformation that David Bowie goes through, that kind of aging and then death. And I wondered whether or not any of that is kind of woven into that in some way. It kind of made me...
It's very possible, yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's the backdrop of it, isn't it?
It is. Yeah, it was kind of early, right? But it was going on at this point, obviously, and people would have been aware of it. And that idea of Susan Sarandon, having sex with this woman and then suddenly being like, what did you give me, essentially afterwards, and that
it's really interesting because it makes me think one of my absolute favorite movies is The Fly, which came out 3 years later, I guess. And when you think of it, there's a lot of thematic similarities between the two.
Yeah.
They're both characters aging. They're both about relationships falling apart. They're both about the pain of seeing your loved one being affected by something. It's there's so much actually there. There's so many parallels you can draw. It's very, very different types of movies, and it's treated completely differently, but the core of it is
you're right.
Quite similar, actually.
Yeah, you're right. They have kind of, and both kind of very stripped back, quite simple in terms of their plot, right? Like you are essentially watching a relationship fall apart when one of them starts to age and die, essentially. Let's talk about the infamous lesbian sex scene in the middle of this. It's kind of the scene that the film is known for, right?
Yeah.
Even when you look up the film online on Wikipedia, it's kind of described as an erotic vampire movie.
Yeah, I saw that.
Do you see it that way? Do you see it as a kind of erotic movie?
When I think of how a sex scene should be shot, he does a lot of that. Like those close-ups of hands, those close-ups of skin, like seeing the goosebumps on skin, all those things that make like the details of it that make a scene very erotic. But the overall impression is not particularly sexy, even though you have those gorgeous human beings. I don't find those scenes extremely arousing, to be honest.
Yeah.
But again, maybe that's because the style in this case kind of makes this feel less striking than it could be. I guess at the time, the fact that he would show a lesbian scene was very unique.
Yeah.
Which is I love that he did that. I love that idea of bisexual vampires. And if you live 3,000 years, why on earth would you only want to be with one type of person?
Yeah.
That makes perfect sense. And I think that that's probably one of the reasons why the vampire subgenre lends itself so well to bisexuality. It's just, and you can, if the blood is the metaphor for sex, everybody, you can drink from anybody.
Exactly.
It doesn't make a big difference.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's something, the way that the scene starts, it's so artificial, that silly, like, oops, I spilled my wine. Are you making a pass at me? Like, she's super cool, by the way. The way she delivers that, are you making a pass at me? I feel is really, like, she's so cool. But it just kind of like goes from 0 to 100 all of a sudden with, oh, there's wine on my shirt. Well, I better take it off and you better watch, and then we should start kissing.
I know, I love it. It's like
is this porn film level.
It is. And you're right, like she's in a straight relationship, right? Susan Sarandon's character, but she does seem she's very much up for it, right? Like you say, she kind of overtly brings it up from that moment when she says, oh, are you making a pass at me? Like, she seems very much into it. It's not, we talked about the consent thing earlier, but it's not as if she isn't up for having that kind of sexual encounter with Catherine Deneuve at that point. She seems very much
totally.
Up for it,
and it's also really interesting that, again, she's, like you said, she's presented as being in the straight passing relationship, and she's presented as most likely being straight. And then there's this scene, and it feels like maybe it's the attraction of this creature that's kind of, this eternal creature that transcends gender, and maybe there's something to that. But then after that, when she's talking to her husband or her boyfriend or whatever that guy is, she keeps looking to the side, and then you understand she's looking at women in a pool and she's imagining those women naked.
Yes.
I guess.
Yeah.
And then suddenly you go, oh, has she always had that latent bisexuality that's only found a way to express itself now? Like, what exactly is going on here?
Yeah. It's a great, and like you say, it doesn't necessarily feel like it's, I guess it is, it kind of looks like it's shot to be titillating, but it's also not. And I think there is that, again, even the music, there is that kind of, I can't remember what the piece of music is called, but obviously that very famous
It's Like Me, yeah.
Yeah. Like, again, it's like very stylish, very beautiful, very artistic, I suppose, right? As opposed to sort of sleazy or whatever.
It's really trying to be elevated as opposed to just like, here is a sex scene and here's the saxophone to go with it.
Yeah, it's not like it's not like a Basic Instinct scene or something like that, right? It's like a little bit different to that.
And it's beautiful. The way everything about it is beautiful, but it's not, I don't know that many women have had their sexual awakening watching this, like realizing there were, and certainly to me, even rewatching it now doesn't feel like, I don't know. I don't remember at the time go, hey, maybe I'm bi.
yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Not with that movie anyway. I had very mixed feelings rewatching it yesterday and paying more attention to it. Kind of, there's something corny about it. There's something beautiful about it. There's something slightly exciting about it. And those characters, but that's not what the scene does.
No.
I would even say that I find more erotic the scene at the beginning where David Bowie and Catherine Deneuve are in the shower, and they're, even before they start touching, just the fact that you see them both, the way they look at each other.
Yes.
There's something very sexy about just the look in their eyes before he goes like forever. That moment is very, very sensual. Yeah,
you're right. That, again, like that first 10, 15 minutes is maybe sexier than the rest of the film, isn't it? In a way. Yeah, you're so right about that. So there you go. Anything else you want to talk about? Because again, like we talked about, it's a kind of beautifully simple film, isn't it? But are there any other moments, any other highlights, or any other kind of points you want to bring up about the movie?
No, I think we've kind of circled it. There's a small moment that's very 80s that I want to mention because I love it.
Yeah.
And it's almost gratuitous in its 80s-ness, and it's the skater. The guy who's listening to Iggy Pop and skating.
Yes.
And then David Bowie tries to kill him and then doesn't manage, or tried to drink his blood and then doesn't manage to do it. But there's something about that moment that's just, it's one of the most beautiful shots in the entire movie too. Like he's backlit and there's that haze in the background, and it's just so gorgeous. But But it's if you had to find one GIF that encapsulates the 80s, I think that would be a good contender.
Yeah, you're so right. And I do think it's like really, and this wasn't really planned, but this is what I kind of love about sort of talking about these movies chronologically, is that it really does feel like such a sort of segue point between the kind of European lesbian vampire movies of the 70s and then the kind of cool, trendy, near dark Lost Boys movies of the 80s. Like, it really does feel such an interesting transition, the way that it kind of dabbles in all of those movies in a really interesting way, you know?
I don't know what order you're going in for the next few episodes, but if this falls between, say, Daughters of Darkness and The Lost Boys, it's the perfect mix of both of them.
It really is. It really is. Yeah. Like, and that was something I kind of didn't really anticipate until I rewatched it. But, you know, I think it does a really good job in that regard of kind of like taking those kind of 70s vampire tropes, but then also like really bringing a kind of fresh 80s-ness to it as well at the same time, you know? And we talked about how much it is obviously like a very much of its time, but I guess final question for you is, how do you think it holds up? Like, what do you think of it now watching it in 2022? And would you still recommend this to people that haven't seen it?
Oh, totally. And I think, again, I feel like I would recommend it now more than I would have 15 years ago.
Yeah.
I think that at the time it felt dated, and and maybe it's also just because I changed and not so much because the world changed or because we're so much more into the 80s. But I feel like the 80s side of it is definitely much sexier and much more appealing nowadays. But I also feel like, I think that those themes are always going to be resonant and the characters themselves. And I can't imagine a time where David Bowie will be forgotten. But even if he was, people could watch this movie and feel how magnetic he was right away. And if nothing else, like those first 15 minutes. But I do feel like there's a lot to be found in the entire movie. And then the great Dick Smith corpses and creatures and you know, and I think that people should definitely check it out. And they might tweet that I'm completely insane and that this movie is nothing but pure style. And I'm very open to that.
Absolutely. I tweeted last night that I was watching it, and a couple of people said, I hate this movie. Like, it's really, I mean, it still really divides people. Other people absolutely love it. So it's really interesting. But you're right. I think that it, in some ways, it's kind of gone beyond now looking, you know, dated and uncool. And it's gone through to the other side of that. David Bowie obviously always has been kind of worshipped by so many people, is just as beloved now as he was in 1983. But also Tony Scott, right? I think Tony Scott, you know, famously, I think, wasn't particularly appreciated by critics through most of his career, right? And like you said, was kind of accused of being style over substance a lot, especially compared to Ridley Scott. And I do think that now people really do look back at his work so fondly and with so much love.
There's a reappreciation. I think it was high time, and comparing two brothers, a little bit of a bizarre thing to do, but
yes, and they're so different too, right?
And you know, when people go, I hate that movie, that often makes me feel like, oh, I need to watch that. Because I'd rather if 40 years later there's still someone who finds the energy to hate it, it's clearly that movie is taking swings, like making bold choices. And I think those movies are the ones that aged the best. When you have a movie that doesn't do well when it's received, and then you see how it's reappreciated later on, it's usually not because it was middle of the road. It's usually because it took swings that at the time didn't pay off. And then you look back and you're like, wow, that was different, and that stood out, and that was ahead of its time. And maybe it was terrible, but it was still weird and special. And I like that. I like that people still hate it. I think that's great.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I think that's important, isn't it? And I'm with you. It always makes me go, oh, what is this movie that some people absolutely love and other people absolutely loathe, apparently? So that's great. Yeah, there you go. Amazing. Well, Axelle, thank you so much for joining me again to discuss this movie. And like, what an interesting movie. I was worried that there wouldn't be that much to talk about, but there was actually loads to talk about with this film. So there you go. Very rich.
It's the same thing. It's because it's all emotions. It's all, like you said, it's all vibe. And then if you feel something watching it, it's all emotions. So there's very little that you can really express. And I sometimes feel like, you know, why do you love The Hunger? I don't know. So I didn't expect to be able to talk about it for a significant length of time. But I do feel like, again, watch it, see if it makes you feel something, see if it's something for you or not, and see what you can take out of it. And you know, hopefully you will. And I think that those movies are very I love those kinds of movies that viscerally affect you. Those are the best ones to me. It's
Me
just
too.
not necessarily, well, the plot was so good, or like, I mean, this is a shameful thing to say for a writer, but I feel like you can have a script that's not necessarily the strongest part of the movie and still have something, as long as it somehow does something, you feel something in your guts. That's the best feeling. That's what movies can do to you.
Completely agree. Well, thank you so much, Axelle. And just let us know, is there anything that, like, of yours that we should be looking out for? Any new projects coming up?
I'll have Mayfair Witches. I did 2 episodes. So either at the end of this year or early next year. I'm not quite sure when that comes out. And then I do 2 episodes of Mike Flanagan's The Midnight Club, which starts on Netflix, I think October 8th. October 7 or 8, something like early October in any case.
Oh my God. So has he got that and also House of Usher? Are they both coming out in October that we know of? Is that?
No, I think Usher, they wrapped a few weeks ago. So that's going to be a longer, like, I suspect Pulse is going to take a bit.
Okay.
That'll be next year, I suspect. But
okay.
yeah,
all right.
I love everything he does. So I'm so excited. I do this thing where once I've directed my episodes, I don't read the scripts that come after mine. So I can watch that, just kind of like discover it
as a fan,
time as the audience.
Yeah.
Yes. And so I'm so excited to see what happens at the end of this season.
Oh my God, I cannot wait. Well, Axelle, Carolyn, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much. This was so fun. Thanks.
A big thank you to the wonderful Axelle Carolyn. So before we move into the second half of this week's episode to discuss Near Dark, I'm going to take a minute to thank this week's sponsor. That's $20 Patreon subscriber Matthew Taylor. Matt sent me an email and he said, "Hi Mike, I've been a $20 Patreon for a few months and hadn't really thought about episode sponsorship too much because I haven't much to plug. I upgraded my Patreon membership a while back when I was on my commute to work, listening to a conclusions episode for the Mind and Body series, and you addressed a particularly intolerant listener's reply by asking them to unsubscribe. I thought that spoke volumes to your particular character because I knew you needed as many subscribers as possible to maintain your podcast, so I pulled my bike over immediately and signed up to $20 on the spot. I also thought of what I would like to shout out on the show. It's actually my mum, Mary. I remember Friday night she and my dad used to watch old schlocky monster movies on shows like Joe Bob Briggs with my brothers and me when I was a kid, and I think that's where I got the bug. She's always taught me to be kind and see where other people are coming from, and I think that goes a very long way in being a horror fan. Now as an adult, I've gotten her back into movies. Together we watched The Wicker Man and Videodrome last holiday season, and more recently Near Dark for a Women in Horror series with my friends and family. So thank you, Mum. Oh, what a lovely message. Thank you so much to Matthew Taylor for sending me that lovely message and the kind words about the podcast, and for dedicating this week's episode to your mum. And what a perfect episode as well, considering you and your mum watched Near Dark together, which is the movie we are, of course, about to discuss. So a big thank you one more time to this week's sponsor. That's $20 Patreon subscriber Matthew Taylor. And don't forget, if you want to become an official Evolution of Horror sponsor, get your own little dedicated segment in the middle of an episode just like this one, then you simply need to sign up to our Patreon at a $20 level. Just head on over to patreon.com/evolution of horror.
This force, this thing that lived inside of him, came from a source too violent, too deadly for you to imagine. It grew inside him, contaminating his soul. It was pure evil.
What makes you think he'll come back here?
This house is sacred to him. He has all his memories here. His rage. Mrs. Strode, I beg of you, don't let your family suffer the same fate that Laurie and her daughter suffered.
That was a little clip you heard there from what I believe is the lowest rated Halloween movie on Rotten Tomatoes. That's Halloween 6, The Curse of Michael Myers. And that is a little preview of what we had going on over on Patreon this week. Because right now, over on Patreon for $10 donors, we are smack bang in the middle of our Halloween retrospective, a 7-part series where I, along with various other guests, am going through every single one of the Halloween movies in depth. We're going 2 films at a time. So episode 1 came out a couple of weeks ago where we discussed Halloween and Halloween 2. Last week was Halloween 3 and 4. And earlier this week was Halloween 5 and 6. And that mini-series is going to be taking us all the way through to late October when we'll finish by discussing Halloween Ends in depth. So if you want to sign up and listen to that retrospective along with all of our other $10 mini seasons, then sign up to our Patreon at a $10 level. Patreon.com/evolution of horror. You can also sign up at $5 and still get hundreds of bonus episodes and episode collections. And everybody who signs up will also get a very special shout out on the podcast as a thank you. So speaking of, I'm going to give everybody who signed up in the month of August a little thank you. So a big thanks to Daniel Wright, John Cole, Ian Devine, Connor, Casey Phillips, Paul Williams, Sarah Verbruggen, Max Mel Morrigan, Greg P, Rosie Dudley, Peter Christmas, Stuart Roth, Thomas Paul Wilson, Slater Kirk, K. Scott Culpepper, Joseph Cameron Crosby, Kathy Hine, Jill C, Samuel Tyler, Leighton Martin, Sean Martin, Josh Torrick, Mike Blumrose, Mila Taylor Young, Jonathan Holland, Holocreen, Gary Marshall, Rinka Binker, Rowan Mitten, James Reiter, Mikey VTR, Michael Munoz, Fiona, Jackson Bear, Sarah Jensen, Aaron, Kane Walpole, HAJ, Aaron B. Kuntz, Adam Finley, Charlie Roberts, and Raoul Coley. That's the actor that starred in a whole bunch of Mike Flanagan stuff, Raoul Coley. Thanks, Raoul. And thank you to all of you for signing up to our Patreon in the month of August. Hugely grateful to all of you. And one more time, if you want to join them and get treated to all of this bonus content and more, then sign up now. Patreon.com/evolution of horror. That's patreon.com/evolution of horror. Okay, let's move into the second half of this week's episode to discuss Near Dark from 1987. I sat down with friend of the pod and filmmaker Jen Handorf to discuss Catherine Bigelow's horror western in depth. Enjoy. Hello, Jen Handorf.
Hello, Mike. How are you doing?
Hello. I am really good, thanks. Thanks for coming back to talk even more vampires.
I love it. I love it. I am the creatures of the night.
Creatures of the night. And, last time you were here, we were discussing, early 70s Saucy Hammer films. And it's kind of interesting that, vampires have kind of come to quite a different place at this point, right? It does feel like when we hit the 80s, it's like we're no longer kind of frills and ruffles. It's like we're in cool vampire territory now at this point in the 80s.
Well, it's the switch. It's the evolution from the European to the American vampire, which I hate to, you're the one who said cool. I'm just.
It's true.
But that more sort of, because even when you get to sort of see the evolution in Interview with the Vampire, where they transition from the European vampire to the American vampire.
Yeah.
You see them go from the sort of, as you say, the ruffles to the sunglasses at night and all that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And yeah, I guess you ended up with Fright Night, I suppose, was shortly before this, and then Lost Boys was released before this, but I think these would have been in production roughly around the same time.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. And the movie that we just discussed previously to this, The Hunger, where you've got like David Bowie playing a vampire, and it's all like very goth and very cool, and it's like that's where we're at now with vampires,
Oh my God. Well, like Tangerine Dream did the soundtrack for this. Mm-hmm. So, which, they were brought on by producer Dino De Laurentiis, who'd had them on previously for The Keep, I think.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'll get into some of that later, because this is, I came to this film quite late, really. I came to this film well post Zero Dark 30. I'd heard of it.
Right.
But had never come into contact with it, which I later discover is because it went out of print most places.
It's actually surprisingly, we're lucky in the UK we've got it on Prime, but like it's a surprisingly difficult film to get hold of. I've heard that on the horizon at some point there is going to be a nice new Blu-ray release of it, but it's never really had that nice release.
Yeah,
yet,
and it's I just suppose because I went to Blockbuster for the first 20 years of my life and watched what was currently being released on television, I was beholding to programming. It just wasn't something I had access to, really. And by the time I had access to it, I was sort of trying to consume everything all at once. So, but yeah, no, it was Catherine Bigelow winning the Oscar for Best Director, first female Best Director, in like 70 years ever, something like that, which is insane. Yeah, and I went, well, wait, she did a vampire, she did a horror movie? Okay, well, I have to check this out. And so I was watching it from that sort of filmmaker, she's just won an Oscar kind of perspective. But then it was interesting going back this time because I feel like, having had it all wash over me before, I was able to sort of study it a bit more this time. And there were some things that really jumped out at me that I thought was really interesting in comparison to that first watch. But
oh, that's really interesting. Yeah, I have a very similar kind of vibe, history to you. I discovered it after, like you say, The Hurt Locker, Zero Dark 30, these big Oscar-winning like blockbusters, right, that she made. And then suddenly it was like, oh, did you know that she made this like little vampire movie in the 80s, this horror movie? I was like, what? And I think it's definitely a movie that sort of, it does change when you watch it, each time. And I first saw it and I thought it was kind of okay. And then I've sort of liked it more the more times I've watched it, actually, which is kind of interesting. Okay, well, let's do it, shall we? Let's talk about Near Dark from 1987. Set us up, Jen. What's the story, briefly, of Near Dark?
Yeah, I'm really going to be brief about this because I don't think this film is about the story, but I'll go from story to script. So it's a very familiar vampire tale, right? I think the novel aspects are the fact that we open in what is ostensibly a Western, like a 1980s hick town. It looks like they could have outlawed dancing quite recently. And this chap spies a strange lady who's very pretty, and he takes her out in his truck, which I have issues with, which I'll bring up later. But,
definitely.
Which is one of the main things that's hit different this time. He's looking for some hanky-panky, but he becomes dinner, except he doesn't get he doesn't get killed. He becomes a vampire. He doesn't believe her at first. He thinks that she's mad, but he's feeling really sick. We see him try to run home, but he bursts into flames, and then he gets bundled into the truck by her and taken to her family. Now, his dad and his little sister have witnessed all this and think that he's been kidnapped and don't quite know what's going on. So they spend the film looking for their kidnapped / runaway son, brother. Meanwhile, she introduces him to her sort of erstwhile family of vampires. Yeah. The ancient child, which is hilarious. I love that trope of this.
Oh, yeah.
It's like the child who's actually thousands of years old, but in the child's body. The fly off the rail wild man. And then the two sort of the ringleader and his sort of paramour. And they're fully ready to eat him, cut his head off, do whatever. They're sort of like travelers, wanderers, rovers, rogues, whatever you want to call them. And she says, no, we can't kill him because he's being transformed. And they're like, well, if he can hang with us, if he can survive a week hanging with us, then we'll let him live. But we're going to cut him off after a week if he's too big of a loser. So they go vampire around, and in their vampiring, they absolutely massacre a countryside bar, a honky tonk, if you will.
Yeah.
And this gets the police on their tail. There's a really amazing shootout in a sort of street side motel. And then we come together in a conclusion when they end up in the same roadside motel that his father and sister are in, and the vampires find them coincidentally and decide that they're going to eat them. And so he's forced to choose between his real family and his new family, and obviously he chooses his old family. There's this really absolutely reeks of audience testing coda where he is cured of his vampirism with, we don't really know, a blood transfusion.
I think it's just it's a really, this is something we've not seen in vampire sort of lore up until this point, right? But that in this movie you can reverse vampirism by basically having a blood transfusion and getting more human blood pumped into you. Yeah, quick fix.
Which they do in His Family's Born. I'm interested in super sanitary conditions. And also, like, where did they get that blood? Like, oh no, his dad gives it to him. Maybe
his dad gives it to him, but you do think, how did they? Like, they've got all of the kit they need for this.
There's not enough blood in one person to like fully transfuse another person. That's how blood works. Is that we've all roughly got the same amount and need it. We roughly
how much
need
blood
that
does it take to cure vampirism, I wonder? Is it just like a few drops, or is it more than that?
And they didn't even do, like, I was watching She-Hulk recently, and I had that brief flash of like, wait a minute, if Hulk's blood can infect other people's, like, oh no, because they're related, so their DNA is the same, so that makes sense. But, like, there's nothing special about his dad's blood and, like, we don't even know they're the same blood type. Like, it's all, this is bad blood transfusion science, is what I'm saying. So I doubt it even cures vampirism, is where I stand on it.
It's interesting, though, isn't it? I do find it interesting, the way that vampirism is portrayed in this, because it, you know, like, and we'll talk about this, I'm sure, but I think I read that initially Catherine Bigelow wanted to make a Western, right?
Yes,
but
exactly.
Westerns were not very popular at the time, and no one wanted to make a Western or fund a Western, so she changed it to make it a Western with vampires, right? And it does feel a little bit like at times she's less interested in the vampirism. Like, there are no fangs in this. There is there's a bit of biting, and then there's easily kind of curable vampirism as well. And it's like, in a way, it's less about that and more about this guy choosing, like you said in your synopsis, kind of choosing which family he wants to belong to, almost, right?
Yeah,
and
very,
it's
very much.
Yeah.
And it's so let's talk a bit about, you know, how the film came to be. So this is Catherine Bigelow's second film, but first singular directing credit.
Yeah.
Her first directing credit was a biker movie with Willem Dafoe that she co-directed with the guy who plays the sheriff in Mulholland Drive.
Yeah, the cowboy in Mulholland Drive, isn't it? The creepy cowboy. Yeah.
And he produced like he produced other things for David Lynch. So she starts with this feature film that's a motorcycle movie, which is a very Western, very, you know, road movie, very similar vibe.
Mm-hmm.
That's her experience before this film, so that makes sense. And she got into that via the arts. You know, she grew up in California with fairly normal parents, librarian mom. And then she got into the arts and went to art school in California before moving out to New York City and working with people there, getting her MA at Columbia. So very like classical education, like very driven that direction. So she goes from that to making this motorcycle film with this artist who she's met, who's this other chap. And then at some point in the mix, she meets a dude named James Cameron.
Mm-hmm.
Now this is like a whole rabbit hole if you go down this side of things, because not to mention cut to 25, 30 years later where they're head to head for the Academy Award and she wins and he loses.
Yeah.
But after this film, they were married for 2 years, at the end of which she filed for divorce because he met think it's Linda Hamilton on Terminator, and married her instead, and he later divorced her as well. He's been married 5 times, this guy. I'm not making this like the James Cameron divorce show, but interesting that the woman he divorced to marry Catherine Bigelow was his producer and co-writer on the Terminator. So
Right, wow.
The reason I'm painting this picture is you can imagine, so he's already married, he's done the Terminator, he's done Alien, he's doing pretty well in Hollywood. He comes from an arts background as well. Catherine Bigelow meets him probably because she's turning in these sort of David Lynchian cool artist circles. There's not a real account of how they've actually met. I'm imagining zigzag black and white carpet and deep red curtains, but
Absolutely.
that's just painting a story. Something else we know for sure is cut to years later, and the script for Hurt Locker, she's not sure she should do it. She sends it to James Cameron. He says, drop whatever else you're doing and do this. So we know she comes from a place of trust for him. She ends up with 3 actors from Alien in her film.
Yeah.
Which sets her up incredibly well to make this production. You know, they've got this family unit vibe. They've worked together. She knows they're badass. They've just been in this film that absolutely smashed the box office.
Yeah.
So, commercially and creatively and on the growth of her career, it's a really good idea. Her co-writer, and I find it really interesting, Bigelow going into this field of men, she's always co-directing with a man at first, co-writing with a man at first.
Yeah.
And she picks really clever collaborators. Her co-writer on this was the writer on The Hitcher. So if you're going to make a horror film, work with somebody who's made a horror film that absolutely makes sense and that absolutely knows the genre. So she got together with her co-writer, and it's, as you say, at first they wanted to write a Western, and they were trying to shop around Westerns, and they got rejected for a load of those. And then it's, well, what is commercial now? Okay, vampire films are commercial now. Well, let's make a vampire Western. Let's sneak it in. We can package it with James's, hot fire crew. We'll start talking to some people in LA. We'll pitch it to some people in LA. And they come across, and I'm not sure who was first, but Delu De Laurentiis, who is the executive producer and whose company oversaw the film, who is the godfather of clever producing as far as I'm concerned. He invented loads of ways that we finance and produce films today, as well as having, his films are always memorable, even if they're not award-winning. They're still oh, I see why he made that. That's an interesting choice.
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
So they pitch it to De Laurentiis, and he's like, cool, I'm going to package it with Tangerine Dream, who I've worked with before. And I will say the actual producer who, the on-the-ground producer whose only other project before this really was Demon Seed, which is a bonkers
what a film.
CV of one.
Yeah.
They were LA rich kid, royal. Their dad was an agent. They were very much sort of given the keys to the kingdom with they could do kind of whatever they wanted. Demon Seed they co-wrote with their brother and co-produced with their dad. So you can see it's very much a bit of white privilege going on there, sort of a situation, or certainly at least nepotism.
Yeah.
But so you've got this producer who's there because of the industry. You've got De Laurentiis, who knows what the audience wants inside and out, who's bringing on this really cool vibe of Tangerine Dream. The soundtrack's amazing. You've got James Cameron, who's gifting an introduction and a letter of good faith from his 3 leading cast members, aside from obviously Ripley. But and then you've got Catherine Bigelow, who has proved herself to have amazing artistic taste and has attached herself to the right people very early on. And you get, it's another one of these films that is made to please the marketplace, but done so very savvily by someone who has excellent taste.
Totally. Yeah, I agree. And I think the thing about Catherine Bigelow as well, and I was reading about this too, is that, she's so smart, clearly. Like, obviously, she's a brilliantly artistic director, but like you said, I think she knew it was a struggle for her through the 80s, right, to get a solo director credit. And to even direct this picture, apparently it was really difficult. You know, people were interested in it, other production companies and other distributors, but they were like, but we want someone else, more of a name,
right.
a man to direct it, right? At this point in time, a lot of the big Hollywood female directors were directors of like romances or comedies, right?
They kept trying to pitch her after her first film. They kept trying to pitch her high school comedies.
Totally,
you know,
exactly.
Do a high school comedy,
Amy Heckerling and people like that, right? And, you know, that was what they thought women directed at this point. And obviously, Catherine Bigelow has always been kind of against the grain in terms of she directs movies that you might think of as stereotypically more male films, right? War films and all of that kind of thing. And I think she knew that, and she was smart and savvy enough to know who to work with in order to create the vision she wanted to create for this movie. So all of that is kind of fascinating, I think.
Well, very much so. And I think when you look at something as well, because Point Break is directly after this.
Yeah.
So with you know, not to make everything gendered, blah blah blah. But welcome to podcasts.
Yeah.
But she knew how to navigate this world. She knows, you know, she's not dead. She looked at what was going on and said, as a woman, I am singular. Regardless of what the industry wants, I'm being told that there are these requirements of gatekeeping. So I'm going to attach myself to men to get me through. And certainly not in a, you know, James Cameron didn't direct this film for her. Not in that way. That's not what I'm saying in the slightest. You can definitely see her all over this. But in a very clever way, you know, okay, so I co-direct, I co-write. Then she directs a film with 5 leading guys who every guy wants to be or secretly wants to fuck.
Absolutely.
And it's, you know, she creates these films for her male audience.
Mm-hmm.
As a way to say, it's okay, guys. You know, I'm one of you.
Yeah, don't worry.
Don't worry. I'm a cool girl.
Exactly.
Oh my God, she's the cool girl director. You're not like other girls. I feel so comfortable talking to you.
Yeah.
And then she friend zoned James Cameron. But yeah, so she's always had that. And then you see when she gets to Hurt Locker, when she gets to Zero Dark 30, both she and the industry sort of find their confidence in supporting female protagonists. And her female protagonists are no different from her male protagonists. They're not, you know, she's not suddenly making soft high school rom-coms because she has female leading characters. She's making the same tone of films that she always had.
Yeah.
She's just making them with female protagonists.
Well, she was one of the, I remember as well, for a long time, and thankfully this has changed a lot in the last decade, but for a long time, she was one of the, like, maybe, 5 women that had directed horror films of note in Hollywood, right?
Or
you know,
it
was
all.
like, at all, exactly. It was, you know, I remember that, you know, back in the day as a horror nerd, reading about horror and being like, oh, here are the 5 great horror movies by women you should check out, you know, and Near Dark was always one of them. And, you know, that was always the case for a long time, that it was sort of one of a kind because it was this creepy, you know, nasty, scuzzy horror vampire movie that happened to be made by a woman.
Yeah,
you know? And that's really interesting.
It is so weird in, you know, I'm grateful to live in a time where there are more female directors and we are able to see films from more perspectives, generally speaking, not just female ones, but just more varied perspectives. And I know it'll sound weird to some people or like hyperbole that when you hear a film is directed by a woman, you go, what, really?
Yeah.
But that's genuinely, I think it was probably many people's response to that film because it's not a gendered movie. And to the point that I would say, holy smokes, I dislike the protagonist because of that opening truck ride. And I don't think we're supposed to. And that's a really interesting difference to watching it now from even when I watched it, you know, 5-10 years ago, whenever that was. But there is no way in the world that that scene is being set up as consensual sex.
Right, exactly. Well, let's talk about that opening then. So we get, like you said, we get these kind of our main two protagonists, I guess, meeting each other, Caleb and May, right? Caleb played by Adrian Pasdar, who it took me ages to realise that is Nathan from Heroes. I was like, oh, it's
yeah,
that guy.
Right. It's like, don't I know you from somewhere? You're the politician from Heroes.
Yeah, exactly. And like you say, they meet and he immediately starts coming on to her. And
well, you say they meet. He spies her.
Yeah.
Like prey. They don't meet. He spots her, but also she's actually like probably hooking him.
Well, this is what's interesting, right? Is that he is actually he turns out to be her prey, and so Bigelow does kind of subvert this in a really interesting way. But you're right. There is a lot of like her just saying, I just want to go home. And he just keeps saying, oh, can I have a kiss first? Oh, come and see my horse and stuff. And it's like, he will not take no for an answer, right?
Yeah. And I think what that speaks of is just, I think my discomfort comes from how far our culture and possibly myself have developed in that last few years, where I don't think she was writing him as unsympathetic. I think she was writing him in that metaphorical way that people used to love, of men chasing women as prey. I think it was an intentional metaphor, but I don't think the word rape or date rape was on her mind, because I don't think it's how the culture she was writing for, saw those behaviors. Whereas now, the second a woman says she's uncomfortable, or anyone says they're uncomfortable, if the other person doesn't acknowledge it, we know that there's a problem.
Yeah, we know that they're a wrong-un. Yeah,
exactly.
It's true. It's true. Yeah, you're right. That has changed. Different. I do think, though, that even regardless of whether or not the film wants us to like him, he's certainly probably the least interesting part of this movie, right? So I do think that we, as audiences, everyone knows this movie because they love Bill Paxton, they love Lance Henriksen, they love this group of vampires, even the weird little boy vampire, right? And like all of these characters, obviously Jeanette Goldstein as well, like all of these great gang. I feel like that's when the movie kicks off, right? When we meet this awesome gang of vampires who are way more interesting than Caleb and May, and that love story kind of being the most bland part about this movie, I would say.
Which it's almost with Bigelow, everyone telling her she should be doing high school love stories at that point. You almost feel like that's just defiantly boring in a way.
Exactly. And it goes back to that thing we've talked about before about vampires, in that like becoming a vampire is rejecting that ideal, kind of societal heteronorm thing, isn't it? Of being like, oh, find a nice partner and live happily ever after or whatever. And it's kind of like vampires are always the antidote to that. And it's whether or not you choose that life or you choose the quote unquote normal life at the time.
Well, absolutely. And it's also, again, it's interesting coming from her that in a lot of ways she's rejecting that path. Yeah. And it's the weirdos who are more interesting, which is what horror is all about anyway. Like, it's not a film that drives on its narrative, which is why I think they get away with the weird blood transfusion cure thing. But it's not a film that drives on its narrative. So it does have to drive on its characterization and its visuals, and
its vibe, right? It's such a vibe, this film, I feel like,
And I think that's where her artistic background comes from. She came from like a world of creating happenings in San Francisco, so which is literally just a vibe. But yeah, I have a theory that when she was researching her motorcycle movie, because I 100% believe her to be someone who would research her work, and obviously if she's hanging out with like Lynchian, Cameron film geeks, there's no shortage of people to point her to things. Do you know Blood Feast?
Yeah, Herschel Gordon Lewis. Yeah.
So you know how it's like biker gang gore?
Yeah.
I really wonder, because there was like a whole lot of these biker gang gore films in the 70s as well, where it was sort of, it wasn't supernatural, but it was either drug-induced or they were just lunatics or whatever, where these biker gangs would go around and just absolutely eviscerate hapless people.
Yeah.
And that is so very much what that scene in the honky tonk is.
Yeah.
It's errant bikers who have come and preyed upon the normal people as a sort of, moral terror.
Totally.
And I really wonder if she watched those films when she was prepping for her motorcycle movie, because there's such that, again, vibe happening in those scenes. Just so sinister and so... like the early American Horror Stories, I think, had that kind of really sinister, like, oh no, they're going to slice somebody's throat open and it's going to be horrible kind of tension.
Yeah, absolutely. It's because actually, funnily enough, I was going to talk about this idea of, how much of a sort of horror film is this versus how much of a Western is it in a way. And that, I think, is the most, like you say, sinister, tense horror set piece of the film, that scene in the bar, because you are genuinely, that is a scary situation. And we've all been in the sort of situation where we might be in some sort of bar and a group of people walk in and you're like,
have we, Mike? Has everyone been in a situation where they're going to be in a rumble, or we just learned something about your background?
You're like, I'm in the wrong bar here. Oh shit, something's about to kick off, or something's about to go down. And
I like the idea of you wandering into a regional bar and I've never missed that.
Hey, even as even in my student days, when you'd go into a bar that is very specifically not a student bar, and you go, this is they don't like students here. It's like that kind of a vibe, and it is sinister. And Bill Paxton is so good because he's simultaneously so charismatic and also so terrifying at the same time.
Well, unhinged, so right? Good. Like there's no consequences.
Yeah,
so he could do anything. And our introduction to him is he's saying he's gonna like rip off this guy's face and cut off his head. So it's like it starts at 10. Yeah. Like so many of Paxton's performances, it starts at 10 and it only gets bigger from there. And then Lance is over there as a nice foil. He's really quiet. He's got such a characterful face. He does a lot of good face acting.
So good.
And he only has to sort of do it like the very much the foil to Paxton, where he can take it just low key and balance it out. So you get all these beautiful layers. You get implied backstory, which, to be fair, shouldn't be as much more interesting as the main narrative as it is, but implied backstories, we're sitting going, oh, how old is the kid, and where did he come from, and who made him, and where did Lance Henriksen get into all of it, and where did she come from?
These days this would be an HBO or Netflix miniseries, right?
Oh my God, it would be
where we get the backstory of every single...
There'd be so many flashbacks.
Yeah, we'd get the backstory of every single member of this gang. But they are really interesting, you're right, and I love the trope of the child vampire who is, actually, like you say, way older.
Yeah.
They're old, but they are stuck in a child's body, and there is that frustration, and there's that anger, and there's that almost child temperament that they can't control, right? And I think it's great, the character of Homer in this, and the actor Joshua John Miller does a really good job, I think, of being in this quite adult film, and kind of coming across really well that, again, there is this kid who, again, seems a little bit unhinged because he is this, like, frustrated man trapped in a child's body. Yeah.
And he is older, isn't he, the actor? He's not as young as he looks, right?
Yeah, I think he was still pretty young. So he was born in 1974. So actually, no, he would have only been, 12, 13 in this? So
okay, I thought it was like Children of the Corn, where he's like 22 playing 12. But yeah, it's I think that's what has made it a lasting film, is it's got all of these layers that, it's almost successful despite its narrative rather than because of.
Yeah, totally. And like we said, it's all about that vibe. This is something we talked about with The Hunger. This is something that happened in the 80s, it feels like, where it does become a little bit more style over substance in a good way. But suddenly it's like being a vampire is so cool. Check out these moody visuals and this cool soundtrack. And like you say, the Tangerine Dream soundtrack is wonderful. I love it. I think the second this movie starts and that music kicks in with the credits, it kind of has me, just because I love its vibe.
And with all of the lighting and smoke in this movie, I feel like this movie's lighting and smoke budget was the same as like a Camden disco or something. It's all very and when things get shot up, you end up with this like really that obvious like fingers of God lighting effect where the smoke is highlighting all the bullet holes and the rays of light shafting through. And it's silly, but it's beautiful and it's fun and it's captivating.
And it's kind of it's visceral too. It's kind of like the first act in particular when Caleb is becoming a vampire. you really feel that kind of gross, horrible kind of, scuzziness of his body shutting down and how ill he feels. And, he's sweaty and he's nauseous and he's like, and you really, again, it's like, it's less about the narrative and more about just the feeling of what this guy is going through in that first act.
Well, it's definitely channeling the sort of, drug metaphors, HIV metaphors, the sort of,
definitely.
The drug or intoxicant or virus entering the body. And all of those things were really very real in the 80s. HIV was a terrifying reality in the 80s, and particularly in New York and California where Bigelow was living. And then, obviously the drug epidemic in the United States was horrific still is horrific, but heroin was a terrifying ordeal at the time. So it really pulls on all of those realities, I think.
Definitely. I couldn't find anywhere whether or not Catherine Bigelow and her writing partner Eric Red were deliberately kind of talking about HIV or anything at the time, but it feels like it's so there, I think, doesn't it, in the background of this movie. Like you say, everything about the vampirism in this one, we don't see fangs. We're able to cure it with a blood transfusion, but it feels much more viral and medical, exactly like you say. It's a different kind of thing.
Well, and I think too, I would say I don't think there was any grand political statement being made, but I do think, again, Bigelow's savvy. I think she's aware of what's on people's minds. I think she's making a clever allusion to the world without trying to say anything particular with it.
Yeah, agreed. Yeah. So how much, are you a fan of Westerns generally, Jen? Because for me,
I do like Westerns, but they're so broad. Like, I watched Tombstone again the other day, and oh my God, that movie's amazing. But then if I watch like The Searchers, I get really bored.
Oh my God.
So, and then there's spaghetti Westerns, and I love The Good, Bad, and the Ugly, and A Few Dollars More, and a lot of those. But it's just such a broad descriptor. And then you get modern Westerns like Tarantino's more recent work, and a lot of that's really interesting. But, science fiction films are almost all Westerns because they take place in But yeah, in short, yes, I like Westerns, but I find the descriptors so broad. I
guess the Western in a lot of ways, it's quite specific, I think, but I guess what you mean is it's more specific to a certain look rather than a story or theme, right?
Exactly.
It's a series of tropes, it's a mode. We all know what a Western looks like, I think. It's a set of visual tropes. But also I think there is something that can be perceived as quite old school and conservative about the Western, that cowboys versus Indians type thing, that I don't know, all-American good guy versus kind of outsider. It feels, I think that's part of the reason maybe why this genre is a bit extinct,
It's about frontiers, and there aren't a lot of frontiers left, literally, which is why you get science fiction films. And to be honest, you could say films like The Abyss or Event Horizon or Meg are Westerns. It's just a different baddie, it's all frontiers, but we don't have any frontiers left. And it's interesting as well because film was invented after the West, the quote cowboys and Indians, etc. existed, and in some ways film is responsible for the disappearance of that world, because if we consider that to be the American Southwest, the reason Hollywood existed was to create films. People moved out there because you had easy access to the mountains, to the ocean, to the prairies, to the forests, to the studios. And as they built up, those places stopped existing.
Yeah, exactly.
So there was no more, the frontier sort of closed with Westerns. Then the Western is a love story to the world that existed before films became prevalent. And so, what is the equivalent now? You look at things, again, like science fiction. But if you look at, and this is obviously a bonkers example, but go with me on it. If you look at something like Wild Wild West, you can see that science fiction Western crossover really easily. But even if you go to the spaghetti westerns, all of this, there's all these like rail guns and like explosive setup, like literal explosive setup sort of at the end of technology. There's a lot of sort of military technology in those films. Trains at the time. So you can imagine that at the time those were cutting edge elements on the edge of civilization.
Yeah, totally. And in this movie, you've got this kind of like gang of, I guess, villains, who come into this town, this neighborhood, and kind of turn it upside down. Like you say, when that bar scene happens, suddenly the police are on their tail, like get out of our town kind of thing.
Yeah, like
we
they
need to get rid
out
of these. This guy is caught between this new family and his more traditional family, right? Who seem, again, the much more traditional American
No mother,
family.
though.
No
What's
mother.
that about? No explanation for the mother being gone.
That's
no
really
mother.
interesting, isn't it?
But
yeah.
she was there long enough ago that the little girl was born, so she's only recently gone. He would have grown up with his mom around.
Yeah.
He's what, like 10 years, 20 years older than his little sister.
Yeah.
So
it's really interesting.
As an adult, his mom dies, which none of this, and all of it more interesting than the story he's given.
But it's kind of cool. I like that it's kind of all there in the background as texture. Do you know what I mean?
Well, I think we just care more about the vampires as well. But it's also, I would say, I think it's a stretch to call this movie a Western. Like, it doesn't happen on a frontier. It has cowboy hats in it. But other than that, I'm not really sure what makes it a Western. There's shooting and there's cowboy hats. But, okay, then put a cowboy hat on one of the guys in Point Break, and that's a Western. Like, it's,
There is a very overt Western standoff at the end, right, between Caleb and Bill Paxton's character, where they're literally stood opposite each other before we get into truck madness and it blows up and everything. But it does feel like there are visual cues that make it feel like a Western.
Again,
right?
and I think you've touched on it there. I think we have to say it. A Western is not a genre of narrative or a genre of structure. It's a genre of visual cues.
Yeah, it's often a time and place, isn't it? Really? Yeah.
Yeah, and I think. Because I grew up in Memphis, which is by no means the countryside, but it's countryside adjacent. And most of this film seems positively occupied to me. Like, it doesn't feel like a frontier movie at all. It just has a saloon in it. It has a shootout. It has cowboy hats and a horse and some trucks. It's in the country, which I feel like you can't blame Bigelow for entirely, because she did grow up in California and then went to school in New York. So she's probably spent about as much time in the back of pickup trucks as she did location scouting for this film.
Yeah. So,
it's a mysterious world to her. And again, coming from California, that's always put the cowboy on a pedestal. Maybe that's why she wanted to make a Western. Maybe she had this idea of what that meant. Coming from the area she did, and that's what she wanted to portray here. But
it's in some ways it's more akin to that kind of subgenre of horror that it's like people on the road being pursued, like a kind of Spielberg's Duel, or I don't know. I'm trying to think of examples that aren't Jeepers Creepers. Yes, Hitchhiker, Roadkill, even Wolf Creek or whatever, like those kind. We all know the sort of movies I'm talking about. I guess almost Texas Chainsaw too. Those kind of like
100.
sweaty American road movies almost, And
it's that sort of American folk horror, but it has that added supernatural aspect to it.
Yes, exactly. And I kind of liked the inclusion, because when I first watched it, I was a bit like, why are we spending so much time with the father and little sister? I was kind of a bit like, what is the point of these characters? But I did.
What is the point of you?
Well, yeah, I was a bit like, why are we spending so much time with them? But I did kind of like the way it comes together at the end with this idea of, them all coming together in that motel. When the little boy finds the little girl at the vending machine and is like, oh, hello, all of that was like, I thought that was quite interesting and creepy. And then, the way he has to kind of choose between his two families is kind of interesting. Like you said, I wonder if it might have been more interesting and less pandering if he had chosen his vampire family ultimately and not reversed back into being a human at the end.
Well, exactly. Yeah. The end definitely feels like an audience tested choice. But again, that kind of feels what Bigelow was trying to do at this point in her career, was make something that people wanted to engage with.
Totally, yeah, a more audience-friendly movie in a way, yeah.
Exactly, and you get the you know, the thesis of his normal life, the antithesis of his vampire family, and then the synthesis, which is him and May and his dad and his sister. And, you know, May becomes a mother figure for his sister, you know, and he and May become the new family dynamic as his dad ages. But, I mean, they all age, but, you know, significantly closer to death.
Yeah, but, exactly. Yeah.
But, yeah, so it you know, it's nice and neat. It's nice and neat with a nice little bow because it's made by savvy people.
Yeah, exactly. Because he even turns May back into a human at the end as well, doesn't he? He gives her a little blood transfusion.
So it doesn't need to be blood you're related to. So it just needs to be just any blood you can get your hands on.
Just inject him with a little bit of human blood. It's fine. And it's fine. Yeah, it's almost like a kind of fantasy ending in a way, isn't it? Where we've got all of the vampires burn up in the sun and then the two of them literally are in this kind of embrace in the sunlight at the end, aren't they? Now that they're human again together.
It really is. Yeah, the fantasy element is definitely there. It's got that sort of like legend-esque sort of bombasticness to it.
And the vampires themselves are all, it's not like all of the vampires are just blanket evil, right, as well. You know, you've got the kind of, it almost was a bit Anne Rice, I think, like you've got the kind of slightly more tortured vampire, or, you know, you've got the crazy sadistic one, but you've also got ones that maybe seem a little bit more reluctant. Like May feels like she's almost a bit more of a reluctant vampire, you know, so I think that's kind of interesting too. This is like a new era of vampires we're moving into at this stage.
Well, and I think it's the idea of what happens if you became a vampire in the last decade versus if you're thousands of years old. I feel like there's a pretty clear argument that people just ultimately go mad in this film. Like the longer they're alive, the more they hate humans, the more they see them as food or pests or nothing, you know, insects.
Totally.
And the more they just go a bit mad being alive forever. Yeah,
this is something we talked about with The Hunger as well, and it is something that is really being introduced in the 80s onwards, is this idea of like, actually, what is that really like to live as a vampire and never age and live forever? Does it get really boring? Do you go mad? You know, like the monotony of being a vampire as well, and what that means and everything. And this is all starting to be explored at this point in time, I think, which is kind of cool.
Yeah. That it's getting a more broad investigation than just, you know, landing in Whitby and all that kind of stuff.
Wandering in the night, appearing in windows and then being staked, basically. Yeah,
exactly.
It's a different kind of thing. You know, there's a line in it where Caleb is, you know, when he's become a vampire and he says to May, "What do we do now?" And she goes, "Anything we like till the end of time." And it's like, God, that's a lot.
That's the worst date ever.
Yeah.
I don't know. What do you want to do? I don't know. What do you want to, just forever?
Yeah, forever. It did start to feel, it felt a little bit like that mid-pandemic at one point, didn't it? I think. It's like, what do we do? Another game of Trivial Pursuit? Yeah, sure. Let's do this.
Sounds good.
I did like the way, I loved the visceral final act, though, when Bill Paxton attacks him in that truck and he gets all burnt and black and tarred and everything. Like, I just think all of that stuff was great, you know?
And again, like, very Terminator, very James Cameron.
Very.
And it's I think we've got the same cinematographer on this film as well.
We do, yeah,
so
we do.
You can imagine, you know, those setups are going to be something that, again, Catherine's not, you know, she's a clever person, and she knows, okay, they've done this crazy car chase before. I've never done anything like this, but obviously she did things on the motorcycles previously. But we're going to use a similar setup to what they did in Terminator, because I know it works.
Yeah, it's so good. Yeah, the cinematographer, Adam Greenberg, you can totally tell, actually, can't you? Like, I didn't know that when I first watched it. And then when I knew that, I was like, oh, yeah, of course, there are. It does have a kind of similar sort of vibe and look, I think.
I mean, honestly, can you wish for a better setup than, you know, disregard whatever was happening between them romantically at the time, but somebody who's just made a massive blockbuster ensemble film says, I'm going to vouch for you to 3 of my main cast, and you can use my cinematographer. I'll get him to do it for you as well.
Yeah.
And I'll introduce you to everybody I know in Hollywood.
Yeah.
It's yours to fuck up.
I know, incredible, and she didn't fuck it up, right?
No,
I mean, this is the thing,
she didn't.
And the movie didn't do initially that well at the box office, and this is partly to do with the De Laurentiis group, which you've mentioned already, because at this point they were sort of going under. In August of 1987, they were 16.5 million in debt. And they continued for a couple more years, but they basically weren't able to pay for any marketing for this film. And so not many people went to see it. It had a budget of 5 million and it ended up grossing 3.4 million. So that's kind of considered a flop, isn't it, really?
Well, exactly. And it's an art house film as well.
Yeah.
To some extent, like it's an art house horror for the time. It's, even though it tries to be quite populist, it's still, you know, crafty and layered and beautiful.
Totally. It's a move, like we talked about, it's a movie of vibes, right? Isn't it? And again, if you compare it to The Lost Boys, which came out, I think, a couple of months earlier, its budget was 8 million and it grossed 32 million. You know, that was a much more mainstream smash than Near Dark at the time, which is interesting.
Well, and he was known then as well, right? What's
Joel
his name?
Schumacher. Yeah. And it had kind of like Brat Pack actors in it, and it was much more kind of mainstream. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, it just had a slightly better packaging to appeal to a broader audience, and it came out a year before, so people felt a little bit like, oh, I've seen that one.
Yeah.
And then, as you say, the late 80s were not great for De Laurentiis. VHS was sort of a confusing place in the marketplace still at that point.
Yeah.
And home video hadn't really found its sea legs to the point that it would in its 90s, where it really rescued a lot of production companies.
Yeah. And of course, Westerns weren't very popular, particularly for young audiences. So you know, this is the thing. If you've got this like art house Western, it's not necessarily going to pull in an audience of teenagers, for example.
Well, exactly. And you know, again, you've got a director who grew up in California and New York, and you have to sell a film to a lot more places than that to have it compete on that level. Yeah. But you know, I'm glad it exists as an artifact of her career. I'm glad it exists as the evolution of vampires. It's not like, oh my god, it's in my top 10. I mean, I'm sure it's on some people's top 10s. But
it is. Yeah, people love this movie. It's really interesting, isn't it? And I think it has grown over the years. Obviously now, you know, it didn't have an initial great reception, but it's become a real cult favorite, I think, hasn't it?
Yeah,
you know?
and I struggle with that only because you know, I think it's an interesting artifact of her nascent work. I don't think it's perfect. I think it's pandering in a lot of places. I think it's amazing to see these people doing raw, early things in their careers. But, you know, I guess I like things to be a little bit more fully formed before I put them in a top 10. I guess other people's top 10s might be about like the rawness and the creativity, which so I recant my, I don't see that. I can see it. It's just a different top 10.
No, I totally get, and it's not personally for me one of my absolute favorites either, but it is definitely a movie that is kind of growing on me the more times I watch it and the more I think about it. And I can't deny how well, and I like I keep saying, I really love the look and vibe of this film. I really like the cast. Obviously, Bill Paxton, Lance Henriksen, some of these others are just great to watch. Like you say, the story itself and the characters are pretty thin, so you kind of have to find other stuff to enjoy about this movie, I guess. You know,
but
and it's a bit rough and ready.
It's definitely there.
Yeah, totally. And you know, like, you know, it's one of those movies, like we said, both of us had the same experience where it's like years later, people are going, oh, Catherine Bigelow, she made this like weird little vampire film, and people are now discovering it years later, which is really cool. And I think you can also kind of see this movie's influence. Oh, even more than The Lost Boys or Fright Night. You know, when you look at movies like From Dusk Till Dawn, I feel like that's very Near Dark, isn't it? Like even Girl Walks Home Alone at Night, these kind of like weird, westerny, vampire-y, kind of quite scuzzy, sweaty movies. You know, it does feel like Near Dark kind of established that sort of vibe, you know, which is really interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think in that way, it's also a filmmaker's beloved film, as in, you know, people love to go back to it. It's a bit elusive. It's a great director's early work, which was widely ignored. It's got a really interesting, you know, the soundtrack and the creatives involved. So it's one that, you know, it being slightly difficult to get your hands on. It's one that you know
that makes a difference as well.
It does, doesn't it? I mean, let's not lie to ourselves here. But yeah, so I think, you know, it's very well set up to be beloved in that way. And I think, you know, I don't think all films have to be a success when they first come out. Contexts change, audiences change, and I think it just so happens to be this film's time to rise and come to the foreground and get the recognition it so badly deserves.
Absolutely. But perfectly put. Well, Jen, thank you so much for joining me. It's been such a pleasure to have you back talking vampires again. And just remind people where they can find you and more of your work out there online.
Sure. As always, you can find me on Twitter at Jen Handorf. Happy to chat and answer questions there. And you can find all of my various services on my website. But yeah, I just completed a short film that I directed that's going out to festivals now. So excited to start watching people watch that and making more creepy things for people to enjoy.
Yes, amazing. Jen, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And that's it for this week. Thank you so much for listening, and a huge thank you to this week's brilliant guests, Jen Handorf and Axelle Carolyn. So, I would love to hear from you guys. What do you think of The Hunger and Near Dark? Are you a fan of these two 80s movies? Drop me your thoughts. You can email me, evolutionofhorror@gmail.com, and you can find us on all the socials. We're on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and we're on Letterboxd. On Letterboxd, you can now find the complete list of every movie we're going to be covering on the Vampire series up to the end of the season. If you want to discuss this week's episode with fellow listeners, there are two places you can go. You can sign up to our Discord, or you can join the discussion group. That's the Evolution of Horror discussion group, which you can find on Facebook. You can find this podcast in all the usual podcast platforms, and if you get a spare moment, please could you drop us a little rating or review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or whichever app you use, as that really does help us get discovered by new listeners. So, on to next week then, and I'm very excited for next week's double bill and for next week's guest. So next week I'm going to be joined by longtime friend of the pod, the brilliant Jamie Graham, to discuss two of the most popular vampire movies of the last 40 years, I would say. Me and Jamie are going to be talking about Fright Night from 1985 and The Lost Boys from 1987. Cannot wait. Join us next week for all of this and more on the Evolution of Horror.